Good evening. I'd like to say that on behalf of the Friends of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, we respectfully acknowledge that the ground on which we stand are traditional Miami and Shawnee lands. We extend our esteem and gratitude to the indigenous people who call this place home. We also want to thank our sponsor for the Power of Voice discussion series, and that is School Outfitters. So you can learn all about their construction and classroom update type stuff by visiting their website at schooloutfitters.com. Welcome to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House here at the Walnut Hills Branch Library and online. And my name is Christina Hartley. I'm the Executive Director here at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House in Absentia. We're just down the street utilizing the Walnut Hills Branch Library because we are under restoration. And although we are open for tours, we don't have a whole lot of space right now. So we are using the space available in the neighborhood that is a great partner to us. This is the way our discussion series works. Basically, we will start with our moderators, Dr. Getz and Emma Baldwin, and they'll give us an introduction and timeline and all that kind of fun stuff. And then they'll delve into the questions, and this is very participatory. So when you want to say something, either just jump right in, or if you are online and you want to raise your hand, you can do that. But generally speaking, we'll just let it flow as a discussion. And then we'll go for about an hour and 15 minutes, sometimes a little bit longer, but we do need to wrap up about 8:20 or so at the latest to get things cleaned up for the library. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to John to get us started with our timeline. And I will pull that up here in just a second. All right.
Thank you, Chris. This is a long timeline, and I won't talk about it, but I'll just try to hit some of the highlights. The first thing to notice is 1829 for us, for Harriet Beecher Stowe fans, Catherine and Harriet Beecher at that point, and their students write letters and circulate petitions in support of the Cherokee Nation, keeping its ancestral land. This was at the time. Well, a year later, we have the Indian Removal Act, which allows President Andrew Jackson, who was really pushing for this, to relocate Eastern Native Americans west of the Mississippi into what would be called the Indian Territory. It's a good starting point, for a sad starting point for the discussion. And this represents a departure from the way that Presidents Washington and Jefferson interacted with the Native American tribes. They tended to view them as sovereign nations. Suddenly went out the window with Jackson and with this Indian Removal Act. By the late 1830s, you've heard of the Trail of Tears. Here's a description of it as Cherokees are forced from their homelands and moved to the Indian Territory west of the Mississippi. It's now Oklahoma. Thousands died on the journey, and other tribes were involved too, besides the Cherokees. The supposedly 5 civilized tribes of the southeastern U.S. Basically, it was ethnic cleansing. Skip ahead after the Civil War, 1876, the Great Sioux War of 1876, known as the Black Hills War. It's an alliance of Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne against the U.S. government. Led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, Native Americans defeat Custer, famous Custer's Last Stand, at Little Bighorn, but by the next year, the Native Americans had lost the war. It is at this time that the woman who would become Zitkala-Sa is born, Gertie Felter, near the Yankton Sioux Indian Agency in Greenwood, South Dakota. And so she will, interestingly, as a young adult, change her name from Gertie Felter, and then Gertie's mother returns to the last name of her prior deceased husband, and her daughter becomes Gertrude Simmons. She will also adopt the Native American name, the Sioux name, Zitkala-Sa. And this always strikes me as interesting as far as her identity as a writer, because she was fashioning herself. She was developing an identity. And she was very conscious of this. She said at one point, several years later, Then I chose to make a name for myself. And I guess I have made Zitkala-Sa known for even Italy, writes it in her own language. So she becomes a writer of some significance around the world. Self-fashioning is something we see in a lot of writers, particularly some of the minority writers that we looked at different points in this series. Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Malcolm X, we'll talk about in the fall, Tony Cade Bambara, Alice Walker, all of those people fashioned their own names in some ways. They didn't just take the name that was handed to them. One of the consequences of the defeat of the Western Native Americans was the boarding school movement starting in 1879, Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania. The boarding school movement, which was designed to take Indian children, take them out of their homes, put them in these boarding schools, and try to turn them into Anglo-Americans. There, change the customs, root out the language, all of those things. The next step for that is 1887 with the Dawes General Allotment Act, providing for the distribution of tribal reservation land among individual Native Americans. Instead of having the tribe hold the land together collectively, which was the way they had done it for centuries, we're going to parcel it out, break up the influence of the tribes by doing this. And again, it was an attempt to sort of make Native Americans over in the white man's image, and yet the white United States was not ready to accept Native Americans as equal at all. Another rebellion is squashed and at Wounded Knee, you know, the famous massacre that occurs there in 1890. So Gertrude Simmons, on to the next page. She starts publishing in 1900. She cracks the Atlantic Monthly, the bastion of East Coast literary snobbery, and writes autobiographical pieces. We discussed some of these about a year ago in this series. And then she started publishing short stories, and one of which we'll look at tonight, The Trial Path, in 1901 in Harper's Magazine, another definitely literary establishment magazine. So there was a growing interest in Native American culture here. By 1916, the Bonhams, she's now married, Bonham is her married name. They moved to Washington, D.C., where she's been elected secretary of the Society of the American Indian and becomes very much a Native American advocate for the rest of her life until she dies in the late 1930s. In 1921, she publishes American Indian Stories, which is a collection of her work, one edition of it. And that includes The Trial Path. It includes her autobiographical pieces, and also the other story I asked you to read for tonight, The Widespread Enigma Concerning Blue Star Woman. That's a new story in this collection in 1921. So there was some redress for Native Americans as a result of agitation by Zitkala-Sa and others. By 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act ends future allotments of communal tribal lands. So that's kind of a background on Zitkala-Sa. Let's look at the background for our other writer, Leslie Marmon Silko. And this goes way back. Pueblo Indians identified in New Mexico and what is today New Mexico as early as 1100. Spaniard incursions, the conquistadors come and take over, and the Enigma Pueblo massacre occurs in 1599. Pueblo revolt in 1680 drives the Spanish out of New Mexico for 12 years, but they come back. And yet, because of the earlier success of the revolt, they never quite impose as much of their attempt to stamp out the indigenous culture as they wanted to originally. By 1864, the U.S. government gets into the act. The U.S. now controls this territory, and they do to the Navajo what happened to the Eastern Native Americans in the Trail of Tears. Ethnic cleansing again, thousands of Navajo in 1864. This is during the Civil War, are marched 300 miles in 18 days from their homeland to an internment camp at Fort Sumner in Bosque Redondo. At least 200 die on what came to be known as the Long Walk. The conditions at the camp when they got there were terrible. It was a failure, a disastrous policy, and the government finally admitted that and allowed the survivors to begin another long walk back to their homeland, a very unusual success and tribute to the endurance of the Pueblos in that they were able to hold together under those horrible conditions and actually return to their homeland. So the majority of those Native Americans who lost touch with their homelands were never allowed to go back. And there's a connection with one of the stories we read by Silko, all the walking that Aya does in that short story has been compared to the long walk. This is her long walk, trying to find her husband and care for him. Let's see. Okay, 1948, Leslie Marmon is born to photographer Lee Marmon and his wife, Mary Leslie, a teacher. The baby, young Leslie, is of Laguna, Pueblo, Mexican, and Anglo-American ancestry. This puts her a little bit on the margins in Laguna, Pueblo society. She lives on the edge of the reservation with her family, but she hears all these traditional Laguna stories from her older relatives. She burst on the scene, the literary scene, in 1968 when she was still a college student, published her first story, The Man to Send Rain Clouds. And it got very well received. She won a grant for that. And that enabled her to later on quit law school and devote her time to her writing. By 1974, she's publishing Lullaby, the other story, that story that I was just talking about, in Chicago Review, and also publishes a book of poems. 1977 is her most famous work, the novel Ceremony, which is a wonderful book, and I encourage everybody to read that if you can. It's beautifully written. Story of a soldier coming back from World War II, trying to heal himself from the psychological wounds, the PTSD that he brings back with him from that war. And it takes a ceremony, a healing ceremony from Native American traditions for him to be able to do that. In 1981, she publishes Storyteller, which is a blend of autobiography, photography, poetry, and fiction, and includes in it The Man to Send Rain Clouds and Lullaby. She published a revised edition in 2012, which I can show you here. It's a beautiful book, highly recommended, multi-genre text.
Pages really quick? Can you flip through the pages really quick? I'm just curious to see that inside.
Oh, you will see poetry, photos.
Very nice.
Well, you don't see too many photos there. If they're in there. Hi, welcome. And that's her most famous book. And the last date I put on here is very recent. It's 2021. But it doesn't have anything to do directly with Silko, but Deb Haaland, citizen of the Laguna Pueblo tribe, becomes the U.S. Secretary of the Interior, the first Native American cabinet secretary. So that's a good point to end on, I think, and get into our discussion. And I'll kick it over to Emma here to ask the first question.
For those of you who don't know, my name is Emma Baldwin. I am a citizen of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. And I'm here to just kind of help with this discussion and answer any questions you guys have. Our first question, and unless anybody has anything they'd like to start off with the trial path, what do you find most surprising or challenging in her story, and why?
Okay, who wants to start us off?
I've been orienting myself to realizing that she was giving a memory, like sharing that. I got disoriented at first and I was like, I didn't know where I was and like what, thought I was still in the present moment, and then I didn't feel and so I felt that was a little challenging for me, but it was really cool and it was a nice surprise in a sense once I was like able to understand that history and see what impact that had on like life, you know, like grandmother and granddaughter, I believe.
Yeah.
I found all these stories very disturbing, of course, as I think that's the point. But this one, this woman, this poor woman is being rejected by both her tribe, and she's being used by tribal members who are young, trying to raise money to so they can sell her property. And even in the end, she doesn't know who she is, who she's with, and who she should trust.
Yeah. I think you have the Blue Star Woman story.
Oh, I do. I'm sorry. I'm
and
sorry.
we'll talk about that a little later. So hold that thought, please.
We have a lull. Someone asked, they didn't hear the question. I was trying to type it, but not fast enough. So basically, what do you find most surprising or challenging in the story called The Trial Path, which is the first story on our list of readings? So first, let's give just like a quick synopsis of it. Do you want to do that, Emma? Or should I?
You're welcome to.
So basically, as far as I could tell, it was a grandmother and granddaughter, and it was like starting to rain, or no, maybe it wasn't raining. At any rate, they were out home in the evening, and something triggered something where she was at the granddaughter was asking the grandmother questions, and she was like, yes, your grandfather, but the first one, not the second one. And then she had to explain what she meant by that. And apparently, when she was much younger, the grandmother had been married to one guy, but his friend also liked her, and there started to be a relationship between the grandmother and the friend. When the friend argued with the first husband and ended up killing him. And so the trial path was his punishment. And if he made it through the trial path, then he was okay to continue living in the society. And if he didn't make it through the trial path, then he was dead. Is that pretty good?
That's it. You got it.
Pretty much.
Okay, so I would say the thing that I found surprising was just, I mean, the end was surprising too, but the thing that was very surprising or challenging was that the way that they found justice, it kind of reminded me of, and I actually read Game of Thrones before the show, you know, before the TV series came out, but it reminded me of like the trials by Tomba in Game of Thrones. It was like, okay, if you can survive this manly strength kind of thing, then you'll be found, if not innocent, you'll be found okay to continue. So the whole idea of going down this path where people were beating him up and trying to get him off of his horse was just that seemed very surprising, that would be a form of punishment, especially for murder.
So what sense does that make? I think that's one of the challenging parts of the story, I think. Why would the father of the bereaved father who has lost his son, he has the right to set any punishment for the person who killed his son, and he chooses that punishment and then winds up accepting once the young brave tames the pony enough to, he rides it right to the teepee of the bereaved family and then is accepted by them. My son, father and the mother, and the daughter hesitantly says, my brother. What kind of justice is this? What sense does this make? How would they do it that way?
This is just thought, but maybe the idea of, you know, proving your physical strength is like the pinnacle of desirability, or the like proving your physical strength is more important than any other, excuse me, any other quality. Let Amy take it from there. Go ahead, Amy.
No pressure. I'm not sure, and I probably read too fast, but sort of the sense I get in the story is that it's generations passing one to the other, and also there are serious, strong ties to like nature. It starts with the stars and the grandmother explaining the rules of the stars, and it ends with the stars. So I wondered, because like the last part is, you know, wait, I can't read from that far away. Okay, nestling into her bed of sweet scented grass, she dozed away into another dream. Still, the guardian star in the sky beamed compassionately down upon the little teepee on the plain. So I feel like generations, like there are ties among the generations, and they're looking out for each other. Is kind of part of the sense that I got.
Anybody else?
I think it's a nice contrast with maybe what we're used to, thinking of justice as sort of an eye for an eye and punishment. But there's a cost when you do that. You lose the person if you kill them because they killed somebody else. I think maybe it's looking at what's best for the tribe, for the community. And you don't want to lose a good warrior, good person, and somebody who's apparently going to be a good husband to this, to the woman he was having an affair with. And so I think some of it is that justice, Native American justice isn't revenge. It's more of a trying to figure out what's good for the community, what's best for everybody.
I found it somewhat incredible that the punishment or trial was pretty public in a sense as well. So like obviously like nowadays the way our justice system works is there's like a jury and it's very privatized, and like you can have the jury be contaminated rather easily. And it also reminds me in a sense of, I've heard of like indigenous cultures in Africa as well. They also have very public communal gatherings where they decide what punishment is fit, and it's not like they don't go by standards like what typical US law does. So I thought it was interesting to see those comparisons, and also throughout like the publicness of it all.
Go ahead, Amy.
I have a question. So the horse that's ridden in the trial, essentially, is that the same horse that the grandmother says master and beast will enter the next campground together? So, and maybe I just missed it. Like, is the horse the first husband's horse? Is that, or did I miss that? Because there's some tie between the rider and the horse. So the horse is integral to the process as well, it seems like. But I'm trying to find whose horse it was. Like if the author tells it.
So is it his horse initially, or did they give him this horse to use for the trial?
I think it's described as a wild pony that they just
That's what
ran.
I got from it too. Yeah.
Okay, so it was wild horse, and then it became his because he tamed it so quickly.
So it's a bond with nature again. Something naturally communicates with the horse enough to build this relationship, and then the horse is with him for the rest of his life. I looked up what the name of the horse meant. Huhiyesa. Probably not pronouncing that right, but it means the winner of bravery, endurance, and patience in Sioux culture. It's the name they gave to the horse. So.
Amy, did you have something else?
Oh no, sorry, I forgot to put my hand down. But I also noticed that when the grandfather died, the horse was also killed with him.
Yes.
So again, that
Correct.
just strengthens their tie.
Is this a typical? I mean, are there other Native American cultures that had a similar trial type system, or was this unique to the Lakota? Any idea?
Yeah, I'm not sure, like in terms of, the audience or the act itself.
The act itself.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good thought though. I'm curious
I
now
would
too.
think that it probably was used in some form in other cultures, and that's why it's been so. Maybe one reason it's been so important for Native Americans to get a hold of their own law enforcement rather than have U.S. government enforcement imposed on all the reservations.
Mm.
To have a little different take on justice and maybe a more community-oriented, less revenge-oriented than our society sometimes seems to be. Was anybody surprised that the granddaughter fell asleep at the end of the story and that the grandmother is worried she missed the point or she didn't hear the point? And if so, or if not, why do you think that happened? Why does she fall asleep and miss the part of the story about the horse being killed with his owner?
I think I missed that part. Sorry. Maybe.
I'm so sorry. I'm like not trying to hog all the time. Well, I wonder if it's because in oral traditions, the importance is passing the stories from one generation to the next, as I kind of alluded to before. So for her grandchild, which with Western stories, kids are told fairy tales to lull them to sleep. So that's kind of our expectation when you read a Western canon, I think. But my understanding is limited understanding, and somebody please correct me, is that with oral traditions, hearing the whole story is actually a part of it. So in this instance, if the granddaughter didn't hear the end, she didn't hear the whole story. Also, I just, as an aside, wanted to say I'm impressed that the grandmother could get up and down off the ground. That's impressive all by itself. Kudos to her. But yeah, so I think that's a piece of it. But she says, I did wish the girl would plant in her heart this sacred tale. So she was hoping that her granddaughter would hear the story and presumably share it, which is not entirely accomplished when you zone out.
I kind of felt like at ease with her falling asleep. So like the passage before when she notices that the girl is asleep, they're talking about the ghost path and spirit trail. And in essence, I was wondering if possibly her falling asleep was like maybe getting closer to that like realm. Obviously not death, but I don't know, like you're away from your body, so less material, possibly more spiritual. That's how I was kind of taking it, her like fully encapsulating that story and like obviously it could just be a kid lulled to sleep by a story by their but I would like to think that her in a sense taking on that story fully ended at her sleeping and like, getting closer to a different plane.
Well, if the grandmother's anything like my grandparents, she'll tell the story again anyway.
Exactly.
Because that's a ritual action that, so you don't have to get the whole story the first time, I think. And she's got the main part of the story, the interesting information about her grandparents. So I go back to that quote that Amy had about the stars at the beginning and at the end. I think there's kind of a cyclic structure to this, and that the whole thing can be reenacted enough times that this granddaughter is going to get the story.
You know, as you're talking about that, John, I'm thinking about the contrast between the grandmother telling the story and then telling it again and again and again, and the Native American reality of doing that, or the tradition of doing that, and what was, I think at least in my family, that was a reality, that the grandmas told stories and you pass things along. But I don't see that happening now. Mm-hmm. It's not happening in the way that it used to. And for me, that was one of the compelling self-revelations, I guess, when I thought about that. There's just not that, there's not that connection, there's not the time, there's not the gatherings of grandkids and grandparents in the way that there used to be. Sunday dinners at my grandma's, or getting together for birthdays, big birthday celebrations. And invariably, grandma would make reference to something. Oh, I remember once when blah, 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 and those were special times, but I think it's a loss that kind of thing is not happening. And what happens when you lose the story?
For Silko, you've lost it all if you lose the story. Maybe this is a good place to move on to the second question.
Do you want to read that one? Did you want me to?
Go ahead.
Okay. This next question is for the story, The Man to Send Rain Clouds. How do you think Marmon Silko's portray, or the man to send rain clouds portrays the conflict between indigenous and Christian beliefs? And how effectively do you think the conflict was resolved?
So I think one of the first things I thought about in terms of this story was how matter of fact the two young men were about, and I'm not sure if it was their grandfather or an older uncle, or I didn't pick up on who the relative was, but it was like, okay, he's out with the sheep and he slept in the wrong place or he fell asleep and we knew he was going to die and he died. So let's just take him back. And so it was just so matter of fact, like, they weren't really upset because they expected it to happen. Maybe not today, but they expected it to happen. So they just were like, okay, let's just take him back. And they did all their preparations, and they did all their preparations before they saw the priest, because they knew that the priest would want to do other things, and they were like, we're not going to. So it was very, the conflict is that, they just wanted to do their normal thing, and all they wanted the priest to do was sprinkle the blood. They didn't need him for all the others. So they didn't even know him that the guy was dead when they ran into him the first time. But it was just very like, okay, this is just a part of our day.
Yeah, Christina, I saw it a little differently. I saw the conflict between two separate types of rituals here. So I'm assuming that the family knew that the old man was about to die. They went out to check on him and kind of felt that maybe he'll die, maybe he's dead now. They, as I saw it, they wrapped him up reverently and put him in the back of a pickup truck. But they did that reverently, wrapping him up. And while they're going by, taking him back to his home, a priest passes by, stops him and says, well, how's the old man doing? I haven't seen him in mass. I haven't seen you guys in mass. why aren't you guys attending the right rituals? How's he doing? And they lie to him and say, well, he's okay, everything's fine. And when they get him home, then they start their rituals, which means they have to bury him, I think, before sundown as part of it, or within the next day. They have to bury him soon. So they take him, they do tell the priest then. The priest then finds out. And the priest wants all these Christian rituals that have no meaning to them. And tell the priest, the reason they tell the priest is because one of the women want to have the holy water in him so it can relieve his thirst, which is totally different than what the Catholic ritual would mean. It would be the blessing of the body, not to relieve him from his thirst. So the young guys go out to tell the priest. The priest is all upset that you haven't followed the rituals and you can't have a Christian burial. And they shrug their shoulders at him. So like, if that's the way it is, that's the way it is. And but they'd like for him to go out and sprinkle the body to satisfy their family that he will receive the rainwater that the story is about. They will receive a thirst quencher. And the priest begrudgingly does it, but the priest is saying none of this is right because the priest is only concerned about church ritual, whereas the Indians seem to be, in my opinion, concerned about the ritual of the man, of him. And they're going to do the things that they've learned for him and not for the church. And so I saw the conflict of two different rituals, one that is just a game that a priest is going to play, and then the other one was their rituals. So yeah, that's how I saw it. Conflict of rituals.
Is the conflict ultimately resolved?
Well, he gets to sprinkle the body, although he doesn't want to.
Right. So he does begrudgingly do it. So it's almost like it's a slight merging of things, even though their minds are in different places.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, it is a slight merging, I think. And there would be more merging if the priest were more open to it, I think. Because I don't think that the Pueblos in here see the two rituals as incompatible. I mean, they don't think he needs all this Catholic ritual, but they don't see the two faiths as incompatible, I think. They'll go to mass, sometimes, and it's part of I think you can combine from their perspective, you can kind of take a little bit from here and a little bit from there and preserve your own traditions. And I think but the problem is that the Catholic position here is they want all of it. It's all or nothing. You got to go to mass every Sunday. You have to have the last rites. You've got to do all of these things just this way, and not. And I think the priest, maybe he's worn down because he says he's tired or he looks tired. You're running this culture that he doesn't really understand, but I think he does the right thing. No, right? Do you think?
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
He doesn't really know why he's doing it. And there was an interesting line. As the water disappears almost before it touches the sand, it reminded him of something. He tried to remember what it was because he thought if he could remember, he might understand this.
What do you think it reminded him of?
I think it reminds him maybe of some of the stories of Jesus and reaching out to people who were different from him and people who needed help for one reason or another. And that there's, that's really the message of the gospel, but it's not always rituals. But he's
meant something as simple as money, which of course could be inherently
important in that area.
Important in that area.
Yeah, and that's what burying the old man is supposed to do, to bring rain clouds. If you give him the right burial, he will send the rain clouds that they need for the crop.
So I'm just going to interject for 1 second. And Carrie mentioned in the chat, she spoke with a priest once about an indigenous burial that included both Mass and Native traditions, and he did not seem to have a problem with that. So maybe we've progressed, or maybe the church has progressed. That's a statement to say. Just progressed since I don't know what year this particular story was set in.
Probably contemporary 1974, maybe something like that.
So, all right.
So, yeah, I think it's about nature, affirming nature, and all of these images that are associated with Catholicism are kind of walling out nature. The nuns in their cloisters, you can't see them eat. What's so terrible about eating? You know, that's kind of a natural thing to do, but no, you can't see them eat. The old carved door with its symbols of the Lamb of God is supposed to be sacrificing himself for the good of people, not closing doors, but he's on the door. The old carved door with its symbols of the Lamb, the twin bells from the King of Spain evoke that whole history of Spanish oppression of these Native Americans in the Southwest, and those elaborate churches that they were sometimes forced to build under slave conditions, really. So I think, and then at the end, Father disappeared within the tall, thick walls. So there's all these walls versus the openness and I think one of your point about they're kind of matter of fact about his death. It's because death is a part of life for these folks. It's not something to fear. It's just a natural process. He's an old man. He's lived a good life, and by the end, he's small and shriveled, seems shrunken, almost like a root with a seed that you plant in the ground to send new life. And so you got all this lovely natural imagery in here versus the walls and all the traditions of the church. So I think they're very accepting of death as a part of life, even a necessary part to bring on the rain clouds, to bring on the next, and his name, Teofilo, Theophilus, one who loves God. You know, it's a Christian name. So anywhere's Levi's, you know, they're all, there are accommodations here with the modern world, that makes sense. So I think it's a lovely story, and it suggests a possible compatibility, as long as one of the religions isn't too restrictive. Two religions maybe are better than one in this case. Yeah. It reminded me of something Chinua Achebe said. Some of you will remember when we talked about things fall apart. He said there's an Igbo proverb from Africa. When something stands, something will stand beside it. And he said that was the way that the Igbo people looked at the Christianizing British coming in. Christianizing British didn't look at it that way. They thought we got to stamp out these heathen traditions. But they could have coexisted. And there's an image of some of that coexistence toward the end of Things Fall Apart. So we're in the next one.
Try something in before we begin. I like the point you brought out about the incompatibility of like the two together. So indigenous ways and Christian ways. I hadn't really thought about that before, and how from like indigenous ways they could be compatible, but typically from like Christian standpoint, like assimilation standpoint, it wasn't. And I feel like it was some of the priest actions were rather disrespectful, or like showed that lack of attempt for compatibility. I was just rereading when you were going through the passages, but when he talks, it's like "It's okay, Father. We just want to have plenty of water." The priest sank down into the green chair and picked up a glossy missionary magazine. He turned the colored pages full of lepers and pygmies without looking at them. So it's like, typically if somebody tells you that somebody related to them died, like, you treat that with respect. And it's just like, I feel like it's just in that moment, there's sort of an association being thrown with lepers, pagans, and then indigenous people that are in him going through this was considered typically rather hard time, or at least like a very soulful time. And then when he was like talking about wondering if, is it Teofilo?
Teofilo.
If his body is some perverse Indian trick.
Yeah.
And it's just like the typical like assumption of slaughtering or like sacrifice. That's what it brought up for me of like, yeah, just yeah. I feel like that really helped it come full circle when you said that from Christian standpoints, it's not necessarily compatible with indigenous stuff.
But even when he picks up that missionary magazine with all the stereotypes of indigenous people wherever they are, supposedly ripe for conversion to Catholicism, even when he picks that up, he can't get into that either. He looks at the pictures, but it doesn't have meaning. He's kind of uprooted, really, and doesn't know what to make of it all, I think. It's impolite to pick up a magazine and start going through it when people are making these requests of, I'll just look at this. And I guess today it would be a cell phone, but but the magazine somehow doesn't speak to him maybe in the way that he had hoped that maybe at one time it would have, because he's realizing that these supposedly unsophisticated people are a lot smarter than he thought and have a lot more complicated culture than he thought they did, and that these magazines would suggest.
Amy, you want to go ahead?
So just from like a short story writing perspective, I guess, in short stories, so at the Mercantile Library, we have like I say we, but I attend the short story club. So we talk about like the structure of short stories often. And in a story this short, every word has to pack its proper punch, I guess is part of it. And she refers to a lot of color. Like I was just flipping through, and for 3 pages of storytelling, there's a lot of reference to color. I mean, especially considering she was describing a sandy, like the sandy, dusty background, but like his jacket has a color, the blanket has a color, very specific. She's very specific in her colors, which I hadn't struck me the first time, but kind of strikes me the second time, but I'm not sure where to go with that. And then the other thing I had a question about is in the second to last paragraph. It's about the priest, and her line is, "He sprinkled the grave and the water disappeared almost before it touched the dim, cold sand." It reminded him of something. He tried to remember what it was because he thought if he could remember, he might understand this. And I'm kind of wondering what the priest was trying to remember too, especially considering, you know, how tight the language has to be. And also it's a smidgen condescending the way, and I think it's intentional, like then he might understand this. But the people aren't really asking him to understand their ways necessarily, just to sort of comply with the request. So there's a piece of like condescension in that very just phrase of a snippet. So I think it's very powerfully tightly wound writing.
One way to look at it is that these supposedly unsophisticated Native Americans outsmart the priest who has more formal education than they do, but they get him to do what they want him to do. So it is an Indian trick in a way, just not perverse. It makes a lot of sense what they're doing. Well, maybe we should move on to maybe we want to do the next question.
Thinking about all 4 stories, in which of the 4 stories do you find the most effective social protest?
Well, I do want to talk about the Enigma Blue Star Woman, which I think Dan was talking about.
Yeah.
But it was, there were a couple things going on in terms of, I thought it interesting that, the woman was really, she was upset by the fact that she didn't get land allotment through the tribal group. And that she seemed to be like a part of the community because she had the next door neighbor who brought her food and stuff. And, she had these two guys who were gonna like help her out. And so she seems like she's part of the community. And she, goes against, previous indigenous culture in terms of shared land, but now they have assimilated enough to want their own land plots because that's the only way that they can move ahead because they've been forced to do this by the US government. So she wants her own land plot, and finally she gets her own land plot. And then the tribal elders like, she is? Why did you? It's like tribal leaders who are now all of a sudden disowning her when so I think the protest part is the complete unfairness of whatever system was set up to. So not only was it an unfair in terms of changing the way that indigenous people looked at land ownership, but also it was unfair in the way it distributed that land afterwards. Maybe.
And agents got involved who were not Native American, who were kind of running this allotment process. And there were payments under the table and
right. Because she had to give some of it to the two guys who were and then and then they worked with non-native people to get it taken care of, but and
created a fictitious mother for her, a relative that would give her a claim on the land who she didn't know. And that's one of the reasons the elder was offended. I think this woman lived with me for a long time and she only had one son. She's not related to this woman. But that was the fake argument that these two nephews, as they're called, used to get her a piece of land so they could get half of it.
Right. It was not altruistic on their part.
Yeah, so what it's doing is pitting the natives against themselves, the Native Americans. And that's I think that's why the story is maybe called the Enigma of Blue Star Woman. The puzzle, the enigma is, here are these two people, both victims really, and they're pitted against one another, which is a classic strategy. People in power trying to maintain that power. Get the people fighting among themselves, and then you don't have to worry about them so much. It's based on supposedly somehow a true story on a 1920 land claim by a woman named Ellen Bluestone with a mixed blood Yankton Sioux. And I wonder if mixed blood maybe makes this woman a little bit on the edge of the community, as it did for Marmon Silko's family. I don't know about that, but it's possible.
Any other big protests people saw? Quiet bunch.
They're all sort of caught in this web of the alienation assimilation dilemma, whether how they're trying to learn enough white ways to adapt, but doesn't do them any good. They get shafted by that. She knows just enough English to get into trouble, and just enough. They get pitted against each other. She's supposed to name her parents. She can't. She's an orphan. It's inappropriate. Violates the customs to try to name the dead. Leave them alone. Let them rest. They're in another world now. Down below, really. since this is both the Navajo and the Pueblo believe in their narrative is an emergence narrative for creation. You come out of the earth, and then when you die, you go back into the earth. So it's not like you ascend into heaven, or you're all creatures of dirt of the earth. So the names of the dead should not be idly spoken. It would become a sacrilege to mention carelessly the name of any departed one, especially in matters of disputes over worldly possessions. Well, why? Tribal unity again. If you're going to say, my grandfather owned this piece of land, what are you doing here? Then that could go on forever. You can't invoke them. And so there's this generous neighbor who's nice to her and shares things, and that's really the goal. But that's being undermined by all of these customs being imposed on them that they're not allowed to use really to their own benefit. Zitkala-Sa herself was able to use, to take her education in English and her experience at the boarding school, bad as it was, and to turn that against the boarding schools and to speak up for her people. But that takes a very talented and sophisticated person who can really work through all of that. Most people in any culture are not up to that challenge.
Anyone else want to talk about protest? So the other one that I really saw as a protest story was the lullaby, which kind of leads into the next question, if you don't mind. But hey, the main character is okay. The main character, I just felt sorry for her. I can't believe that this would happen, that she basically signs away the rights to her children just because she doesn't know what they're saying to her, and then nobody backs her up in terms of saying, well, she didn't really need to sign that because she didn't know what you were telling her, and so you shouldn't have just taken the children. And so it really just I felt sorry that she was so proud that she could write her name, but that became her ultimate cause of real grief,
Liability.
and became a liability and the ultimate cause of her grief. And so the fact that and this is she's not, she's protesting, but the whole protest part of it is to see the injustice. How could you take away her children when she didn't understand what you were saying to her? And how is that right? I saw that as kind of the underlying protest of the whole story.
I think another form of protest is her perseverance, even, and I found that rather admirable. And the fact that she hasn't been jaded or made fooled by what's happened to her, because I feel like a lot of people getting, I don't know, hardship is obviously difficult, and separation from your family is incredibly hard, especially when you're in some sort of legal way responsible for that, not knowing. There's such an unfair card to be dealt. So I think, and like what you said earlier with her walking around being compared to the long walk, her perseverance really resonates with that historical moment as well.
I have a question. The children are taken away twice, not? Am I right? The first time they're taken away is that they visited the doctor and they have what appears to be tuberculosis in the story, and then they take them away, return them, and they're quite a number of years older, and then taken away again. Is that what I interpreted? The first time is because of a health reason.
I think they
Right?
just come back for a quick visit.
Yeah, I think it was just a quick visit that they let them come back for a visit and then took them again. But yeah, it was initially because of a health reason. Yeah. But even that, it's not like, okay, we're gonna go take them to the clinic and then bring them back.
Right.
We're gonna take them away.
Right. You're right, Christina. But the pretense was a health reason. right? Yeah, okay.
Originally, yeah.
Yeah, but even that, she didn't realize, she didn't understand that.
No,
that's
she
what
had
they
no
would
idea.
do.
And how many treaties were signed with that same lack of understanding of what the implications really were, because you're confronted as a Native American with this whole legal system coming from England and now in the US, and it's very foreign. In many cases, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And people are signing treaties, or you get a few elders from the tribe together and they sign the treaty when a lot of the other ones didn't want to. All that kind of falsifying or getting people to sign away their rights. It's part of the whole history of the interaction.
But it also, like, the fact that they were taking children away also really, it's a different situation, but it's still the same concept as the, taking the kids away to take them to boarding school.
Yes.
And the whole assimilation. So it's not like this was a one-time incident in this particular case. This like mirrors things that would have happened thousands and thousands and thousands of times to thousands and thousands and thousands of families.
And the kids are losing touch with their language, only understanding more and more English, not speaking their native tongue. So that's a loss there.
Were these stories all originally published in English?
Yes. What prompts you to ask that question? That's a good question.
I was gonna ask it earlier, but the conversation kind of moved on. It was when we were talking, I think it was your point about the lack of oral traditions that you see being continue to be passed on. And not only that lack of continuation, but also the loss of language through. So those kind of can coincide, but also like typically the language I feel like has died first, and then that's also reverberating into, we still have some like English as a colonized, taken over language, unfortunately. But then even with that, it's like that's not enough for these oral traditions to survive on. And I think that's really poignant, unfortunately.
It's always the dilemma for the colonized writer, isn't it? Because if you write in the language of the colonizer, in a sense, you're encouraging that. But the trick, I think, the trick to justify it is, well, one, you're trying to help your own people by setting these stories down so they don't get lost, and that's one of the roles Silko sees for herself, and Zitkala-Sa too. But also, you write in an English that isn't exactly standard English. You make it your own. You try to get some of those rhythms of the original language into the English. And I think when you read either Silko's work or Zitkala-Sa's, I hear a different voice there, because their prose isn't just the typical prose that might have been written by an educated person at that time. There's a certain rhythm, a certain word choice, a certain quality to it that makes it different, and that's what Chinua Achebe agonized over. Can I write in English and still be an authentic Igbo voice in Africa? And he said, yes, but I have to write it in English that is not the King's English, that is my own version of English.
But that dilemma also kind of refers to the fact that in order for it to reach a wide audience, you have to write in the language that's not the small group language. You have to write it in a language that's has more speakers and readers. Otherwise, your message will get lost. So that's the other part of the debate too.
The colonizing language often has more power, economic power.
Well, economic power and just sheer numbers of people.
Yeah.
I like that. I think it was Shaw who was able to incorporate, like, I'm not sure what indigenous language it is, but some phrases. I think that's also important to have that sort of insertion of it's not all just English.
Some of the concepts can't be translated. They have to be recognized by the original word. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That reminds me of Manuel's poetry. Remember a few weeks ago we heard the Spanish poet. Well, actually, he's a Mexican.
Mexican American.
Let's say his last name.
Irish.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, yes.
Were you there?
He writes first in Spanish, and then he has to translate the Spanish into English, and does not do that with all of his poetry, and only for selective pieces, because it's so hard for him to bring the spirit and the soul and that that je ne sais quoi, of the language into English. He does a beautiful job of it, I think, when he does. Who knows? I mean, I could never evaluate whether that's what if I read it in Spanish, would I get more out of it than if I read it in English?
I think too that the words rhyme in Spanish, and then when they're translated to English, they don't. And the same way with English to another language.
Yes.
We're not always looking for rhyming words, so.
Rhyming is also the rhythm, the cadence, the meter, which of course, meter is especially important in poetry, but I think that there's a cadence in the spoken word that varies according to the language. And when I think of the times that I've heard bits of Native American, storytelling or language, it's beautiful. But it's very different from our good old functional, this is the way it is, English.
Somebody once defined standard English or a standard language as a language that has an army and a navy behind it. That makes it the standard language because they have power, military might. It doesn't mean the language is any better. It's just it becomes the standard by force. Is there anything more to say about the character of Aya in that story? That Melissa, I think you were talking about her being, I have your name right. Alexis, sorry, about her endurance, her strength. And a scene that strikes a lot of people when they read this is when she walks into that bar looking for Chato. And everybody's kind of afraid of her. Why are they afraid of this woman? There's a power in her, I think. And wonderful image here. They looked at her like she was a spider crawling slowly across the room. Now that might sound to a lot of us like a very negative image, but the spider woman is a very positive figure in Pueblo and Navajo culture. In Pueblo, she's the creator of the world, Spider Woman. Why? Because spiders weave webs. They also teach, Spider Woman, she's not the creator in Navajo culture, but she's also important. She's a major deity. And one of the things that she does is teach the women the art of weaving. And look how important that is economically to the Navajo over the years with the blankets. And then they're really important in this story. Jimmy's army blanket is not as good as these blankets that the mothers and grandmothers all wove together. She clings to that army blanket because it would belong to her son, but So the link to Spider Woman suggests a certain power about her. And both of these cultures are matrilineal too. They're not patriarchal cultures. The descendants is through the woman, and the women really have a lot of power in these cultures, in these two cultures particularly.
Very good.
Sorry. So one of the things, it's on page 47 that I find interesting is the paragraph that starts with she hated Chateau not because he let the policemen and doctors put the screaming children in the government car, but because he had taught her to sign her name. And so I think it's interesting in a story about, in a written story, the meta of the fact that it was writing that took her children away is kind of an interesting thing to me, that that we talk about the power of words and the power of stories, and for I presume her culture that's oral, but here knowing how to write actually was what caused the challenge for her, that caused her the pain and grief. So I just thought that was interestingly snuck in there, not snuck quite so secretly, but it took a couple of readings for me to catch that.
Yeah, I agree. I remember hearing, reading that line. I was like, yeah, that was the problem. Who knew?
Well, we're getting to the point where we should probably start wrapping up and trying to take an overview of things. So, Emma, maybe check the last, let us have a little look at the last question.
When thinking about all the stories and all the Native American cultures and values, what do you think, which some of those values and celebrations, what do you see in those stories?
What do you see?
I saw a lot of the which one was it? Now I can't remember. They've all kind of blended together. The burial, where they really wanted to incorporate the indigenous culture, but also some of the Christian culture. Being able to stay toned into that indigenous culture is really important to people like us. And also the storytelling, we were talking about that with the language and transferring it over to English, it's completely different. I go to my community storytelling yearly, and hearing it in our language and in English, it's just not the same. But yeah, I see a lot of just trying to stay within your culture, trying to celebrate that and bring those values to the younger ones from the elders.
Anyone else? What values are we celebrating with these stories? Go ahead, Amy.
Sorry, it feels
No,
like
you're fine.
thank you. It feels like a sense, I mean, I get a sense of community from all of the stories, the importance of generations and the importance of community. And also the stories, the majority of them also seem to have very natural elements in respecting nature. So those are kinds of some of the values that I've seen.
Anyone else want to share? Even Dan's quiet. What's up with that?
I want to come back to a point that you made earlier when you were talking about the sense of time in one of the stories, because I think that's some kind of a thread that runs through a lot of these, a sense of cyclic time. Maybe that's more important. Those of us who have grown up in the West, Western culture, tend to think of time as linear, as a progress. We're making progress. We're ever since the Enlightenment, things are getting better. That's not the view. I think so much in Native American culture, it's more cyclic. It's viewing the cycle of the seasons, life and death, and then it all fits together rather smoothly instead of having all of these chunks. Well, now we got this done. We got to invent something else. We got to, now we've got another task to do. It's more living with nature, living with appreciating the cycle of the seasons.
Turn.
Yeah, yeah. And I
Also,
Yeah.
sorry, reminds me of some of our tribal summer camps. It's encouraged to put your cell phones away so that you're not constantly looking at the time of day, when the day is going to end. When is lunch? When is the snack going to be out? Or it's encouraged that we look at the sun and where it's placed in the sky to know the time of day.
Do you find yourself doing that when you're not one of those retreats or events?
No. I wish I could more though, but it's just so part of society to check the time. It's really hard. Yeah, I should more though.
There's certain holiness about that.
Yeah.
With a profound respect and holiness.
There is a specific time of year that we pay attention to where we tell our stories, and that's the beginning of winter, but it's specifically at the first really hard frost. And then we stop them when we get that first like thunderstorm in the spring. And so those are really specific like nature time, like a time frame when we tell those stories. Yeah.
So the stories get you through the hard times.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
We can all kind of come together, and yeah, it does.
That's a beautiful image. Yeah.
All right, so it is 8:20. I did say 8:20. So any last parting words from either of our discussion leaders?
I can't top what Emma just said. That.
All right, yes, we thank you. And that is a really nice image to think about in terms of when the storytelling is most concentrated or more thought-provoking. I'm gonna start telling more stories.
Especially in winter.
Yes. All right, well, thank you all to our discussion group here in Central Walnut Branch Library. Thank you all to everyone tuning in from home and contributing and listening and thinking about these great ideas. This discussion series takes a hiatus during the summer months. So we'll get back to our storytelling in September. And I don't remember the topic. John doesn't remember the topic. It's on the website. Just look it up. We'll start reading in mid-August for our next series. And then, of course, check out the Stonehouse Cincy website to see all of our upcoming programs. I'm going to make one more plug, and that is if you are in the city of Cincinnati, join us on May 12th at 10 a.m. over at the Mance Hotel. Well, it's now Mance Apartments, but we will be joining with the Walnut Hills Historical Society and our other partners on dedicating the Mance Historic Marker. So it's the newest Ohio Historic Marker located in Walnut Hills, and that dedication ceremony is on May 12th at 10 a.m. over on Chapel Avenue. So we hope to see you there. We hope to see you around. And thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.